In 1858, an engineer named George Pullman put 5,000 men with jack screws under every building on a single block in downtown Chicago and raised the entire block 6 feet into the air. Hotels, shops, offices, some of them 4 stories tall and full of guests, lifted inch by inch over the course of days while people walked in and out of the front doors like nothing was happening. They raised the entire city. Not one building, the whole city. And the reason they had to do it is almost impossible to believe today. Chicago in 1850 was built on a swamp. That's not an exaggeration or a metaphor. The city sat at the edge of Lake Michigan on land so flat and waterlogged that the entire downtown area was barely 4 feet above the lake level. Some parts were even lower. When it rained, the streets didn't drain. They flooded. The mud was so deep that horses and wagons regularly got stuck and had to be abandoned where they stood. Entire streets would turn into rivers of sewage and filth. The city had been platted and built without any consideration for drainage because the early settlers didn't understand just how bad the problem would become. They thought they could manage it. They were wrong. The basements flooded constantly. You couldn't build a cellar without it filling with water within hours. Shopkeepers would come to work in the morning and find their storage rooms under 2 feet of stagnant, disease-ridden muck that had seeped up through the floorboards overnight. The smell in summer was unbearable. Dead animals, human waste, garbage, spoiled food, industrial runoff, all of it just sitting in the streets with nowhere to go. People tried to deal with it. They built wooden sidewalks raised a few feet above street level so pedestrians could walk without wading through mud. But the sidewalks would sink into the soft ground under the weight of foot traffic. Shopkeepers would lay down boards across the mud so customers could reach their doors. The boards would disappear into the muck within days. There are accounts from the 1840s and early 1850s of downtown Chicago, where the mud was so deep that a man could lose his boots just trying to cross the street. Horses would panic and thrash, making the situation worse. Wagons loaded with goods would sink to their axles and have to be unloaded piece by piece before they could be freed. And then came the cholera. In 1854, a cholera epidemic tore through Chicago and killed 1,424 people. That was 6% of the entire population. 6%. Gone in a matter of months. Cholera spreads through contaminated water, and Chicago's water was a nightmare. There was no functioning sewer system. Waste just pooled in the streets, seeped into the ground, and contaminated the wells that people drank from. The city was poisoning itself. The cholera outbreak of 1854 terrified the city's leaders and citizens alike. People watched their neighbors die within hours of showing the first symptoms. The disease killed indiscriminately. Rich and poor, young and old, it didn't matter. If you drank contaminated water, you could be dead by nightfall. Doctors at the time didn't fully understand how cholera spread. Germ theory was still years away from widespread acceptance, but they knew it had something to do with the filth in the water. They knew that cities with better sanitation had fewer deaths. They knew Chicago was a death trap. Engineers tried everything they could think of. They built plank roads over the mud, raised on wooden supports to keep them above the muck. It didn't work. The planks rotted in the constant dampness. The supports sank into the soft ground. Within a year or two, the plank roads were as bad as the dirt streets they'd been built to replace. They tried pumps to drain the water from low-lying areas. Useless. The city was at lake level. There was nowhere for the water to go. Gravity doesn't work when you're trying to pump water uphill. The pumps would run constantly and make almost no difference. As soon as you pumped out one area, water would seep back in from the surrounding saturated ground. They tried building drainage ditches. The ditches would fill with water and sewage and become stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and disease. Making the problem worse, not better. The city's leaders knew they had a problem that was getting more severe by the year. Chicago was growing fast, faster than almost any city in American history. It had gone from a frontier outpost of a few hundred people to a major city of nearly 30,000 in just 20 years, thanks to the railroads and its position on the Great Lakes. But if they couldn't solve the drainage and disease problem, the city would collapse under its own filth. People would leave. Businesses would relocate. Chicago would become a cautionary tale. Ellis Chesbrough, the city's chief engineer, had been studying the problem since his appointment in 1855. He'd looked at cities across America and Europe to see how they handled drainage and sewage. He knew what Chicago needed. The city needed to be higher. It needed to be above lake level by enough feet that gravity could pull wastewater through sewers and into the lake. But they couldn't just build a new city 6 feet higher and abandon the old one. There were thousands of buildings, millions of dollars of invested capital, entire neighborhoods. The economic disruption would be catastrophic. So Chesbro came up with a solution so audacious that it seemed impossible. He proposed raising the entire grade of the city by 6 to 10 feet. Not just the streets, every building, every sidewalk, every lot. The entire downtown would be lifted like a cake being pulled out of a pan, and a new foundation would be built underneath. And the cost would be astronomical. The engineering challenges were unlike anything anyone had attempted anywhere in the world. But the alternative was watching the city die from disease and abandonment. The city council debated the proposal. Some members thought Chesbro had lost his mind. Raise every building in the city? While people were still using them? Impossible. Too expensive. Too dangerous. It would never work. But the supporters of the plan pointed to the bodies. They pointed to the 1,424 people who died in the cholera epidemic. They pointed to the mud in the streets and the sewage in the basements and the fact that Chicago was growing too fast to slow down. If they didn't fix the problem now, it would only get worse. The City Council approved the plan in 1855. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Raising the streets was the easy part, at least in concept. You bring in millions of cubic yards of dirt and gravel by wagon and railroad car, dump it on top of the existing streets, grade it level with teams of workers and draft animals, and you've got a new street 6 feet higher than before. It's labor-intensive and expensive, but it's straightforward. But what do you do with the buildings? You can't just demolish every structure in downtown Chicago and rebuild them on the new grade. The cost would be impossible. The disruption would destroy the economy. People were living and working in these buildings. Families lived above shops. Hotels were full of guests. Businesses were operating. You couldn't just tell everyone to leave for a year while you tore everything down and started over. So they decided to raise the buildings too, while people were still inside them. The method was brilliantly simple in concept and terrifying in execution. You dig under the building's foundation and place thousands of jack screws at evenly spaced intervals, each one supporting a tiny portion of the building's weight. The jack screws are basically giant threaded bolts that you can turn to raise or lower them. Each screw can support several tons. Then you hire a crew of men, 1 man per screw. A foreman stands in the middle with a whistle or a bell. He gives the signal and every man turns his screw exactly 1/4 turn. Not a half turn. Not a full turn. 1/4 turn, all at the same time, in perfect coordination. The building rises a fraction of an inch. Then they wait. And the foreman and his assistants walk through the building checking for cracks in the walls, stress in the timbers, any sign that the structure is being damaged by the lift. They check the foundation to make sure it's level, that one corner isn't rising faster than another. They make adjustments if needed. Then the foreman gives the signal again. Another 1/4 turn, another fraction of an inch. Do this thousands of times over the course of days or weeks, and you can raise a building 6 feet without breaking a single window. The first buildings to be raised were smaller structures, tests to prove the concept worked. Wooden buildings, 1 and 2 stories, relatively light. The engineers were learning as they went, figuring out how many jack screws were needed, how to keep the building level, how fast they could safely go. It worked. And the buildings rose. The walls didn't crack. The method was sound. George Pullman, who would later become famous for inventing the Pullman Railroad sleeping car, was a young contractor in his 20s when he came to Chicago and saw the opportunity. He'd worked on the Erie Canal in New York and had experience with heavy construction and moving large objects. He knew he could make a fortune if he could perfect the technique of raising buildings. In 1858, he took on the job that would make his name. The Tremont House, a massive 4-story brick hotel at the corner of Lake and Dearborn Streets, needed to be raised 6 feet to match the new street grade. The Tremont House was one of the finest hotels in the Midwest. It was a landmark, a symbol of Chicago's growing sophistication and importance. It was also enormous. Means the building was 180 feet long and 120 feet wide, 4 stories of solid brick construction. It weighed thousands of tons, and it was full of guests when Pullman started the job. Pullman put 5,000 jack screws under the building, placed at carefully calculated intervals to distribute the weight evenly. He hired 5,000 men, each one assigned to a specific screw. He organized them into crews with foremen who would ensure every man turned his screw at exactly the same moment. The operation took 4 days. 4 days of coordinated lifting, quarter turn by quarter turn. The hotel rose inch by inch while guests went about their business inside. They ate in the dining room. They slept in their beds. They conducted business in the lobby. The hotel never closed. According to newspaper accounts at the time, the guests reportedly didn't even notice the building was being raised. The lift was so gradual and so smooth that there was no perceptible movement. People would walk up the front steps in the morning when the building was at one height, spend the day inside, and walk down the steps in the evening when the building was several inches higher. They couldn't tell the difference. Not a single window cracked. Not a single wall showed damage. Not a single brick came loose. Pullman had pulled off what seemed impossible. He'd raised a 4-story brick hotel full of people without disturbing anyone's breakfast. Pullman became an overnight celebrity in Chicago's engineering and business circles. Building owners across the city wanted to hire him. He could name his price. Over the next few years, he raised dozens of buildings, making a fortune in the process. He invested that money into his railroad car business, which would eventually make him one of the richest men in America. But Pullman wasn't the only one doing this work. Other engineers and contractors saw what he'd done and realized the entire city could be raised this way. Block by block, building by building, Chicago began to lift itself out of the swamp. The process took more than a decade. Some buildings went first because their owners could afford to pay or because they were in areas where the street raising was already complete. Others waited years for their turn, either because of the cost or because the street work hadn't reached their neighborhood yet. The result was a city that existed at 2 different levels simultaneously. You'd walk down a street, and half the buildings would be at the old grade, sitting in what looked like pits or basins. The other half would be at the new grade, 6 or 8 or 10 feet higher. The visual effect must have been surreal. Shopkeepers whose buildings hadn't been raised yet would build temporary staircases so customers could descend from the new street level down to their old front doors. Some of these staircases were quite elaborate, with handrails and platforms. Others were just rough wooden steps, hammered together. If your building had been raised but your neighbors hadn't, there'd be a 6-foot drop between your property and theirs. People built connecting bridges between buildings at different heights. The city was a chaotic patchwork of elevations, stairs, ramps, and bridges. It must have looked insane. Right. Imagine walking into a building and having to climb down a flight of stairs to get to street level, then walking across the street to another building and climbing up a flight of stairs. Then going around the corner to a third building that's at yet another height entirely. Contemporary accounts describe the city during this period as looking like it had been hit by an earthquake, where some buildings had risen and others had sunk. Visitors found it confusing and disorienting. Locals just got used to it. But the system worked. As each building was raised, workers would fill in the space underneath with dirt and rubble, creating a new foundation. They'd pack the filled dirt carefully, making sure it was compacted and stable so the building wouldn't settle unevenly. Then they'd raise the street around the building, grading it level with the new building height. Slowly, block by block, the new Chicago emerged on top of the old one. The new grade allowed the city to finally build a proper sewer system. With the streets 6 to 10 feet higher than before, gravity could do its job. Waste could flow downhill into the sewers, then out into the Chicago River, and eventually Lake Michigan. It wasn't perfect by modern standards. Dumping raw sewage into your water source is not ideal. But Chicago would deal with that problem later by reversing the flow of the Chicago River, another engineering marvel. For now, the important thing was getting the sewage out of the streets and basements. The scale of the earth-moving operation was staggering. Millions of cubic yards of dirt had to be brought in by railroad and wagon. Much of it came from the prairies west of the city. where contractors would excavate dirt and haul it into town by the wagon load. Some came from dredging the Chicago River to keep it navigable as the city grew. The dirt would be dumped onto the streets in enormous piles, then spread out and graded level by teams of workers with shovels and wheelbarrows. Draft animals pulled scrapers to move the dirt. In the winter, the work would slow or stop entirely as the ground froze. In the spring, it would resume with renewed intensity. The Chicago River had to be dredged constantly to keep it navigable. As the city raised its grade, the riverbanks got higher, which meant the river itself needed to be deepened to maintain the same water depth for boats and barges. New bridges had to be built at the higher grade. The old bridges became useless and sitting too low to connect the raised streets. Sidewalks had to be rebuilt at the new level. Water mains had to be relocated. Gas lines, which provided lighting for the city, had to be raised and reconnected. Every utility, every piece of infrastructure had to be redone. And through it all, the city kept functioning. Businesses stayed open. People lived in their homes. Construction was happening everywhere all the time, but Chicago didn't pause its growth to remake itself. It did both at the same time. Hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Not everyone participated in the raising. Some building owners refused to pay for the cost of lifting their structures. The price could be substantial, especially for larger buildings. The jack screws, the labor, the time, the temporary supports, the risk of damage, it all added up. These holdouts stayed at the old grade, which meant their buildings ended up sitting in pits, several feet below the new street level. Customers had to walk down steps to enter these shops. The buildings looked like they'd sunk into the ground, though of course they hadn't moved. The ground around them had risen. Some shop owners just built new entrances at the raised street level and turned their first floors into basements. They'd cut a new door in what had been the second story, build a staircase up from the street, and conduct business from what was now the ground floor. The original first floor became storage space. This created some bizarre situations. You might have a building where the first floor was below current street level, the second floor was at street level, and the third and fourth floors were above. The floor numbering would be completely wrong. The second floor was now the ground floor. Other building owners whose structures hadn't been raised would just abandon them. The buildings would sit there, empty and decaying, several feet below street level, until eventually they were torn down and replaced with new construction at the proper height. There were engineering disasters. Some buildings cracked during the raising process. The stress of being lifted, even gradually, could expose weaknesses in the foundation or the walls. Bricks would separate, timbers would split. In a few cases, walls collapsed. Other buildings settled unevenly after being raised. The filled dirt underneath might compact more on one side than the other, causing the building to tilt. Floors would slope. Doors wouldn't close properly. Windows would stick in their frames. A few buildings collapsed entirely, though surprisingly few considering the scale of what was being attempted and the number of buildings that were raised. The engineers had done their homework. They knew what they were doing. But the risks were enormous. If a building's foundation wasn't strong enough, or if the jack screws weren't placed correctly, or if the lift wasn't coordinated perfectly, the entire structure could come crashing down. One of the most famous raising operations involved an entire block of buildings on Lake Street. The buildings were connected, forming a continuous row of storefronts with shared walls. The engineers decided to raise them all at once, treating the entire block as a single structure. And they put jack screws under every building and coordinated the crews so that all the buildings would rise together, maintaining their connections. If one building rose faster than its neighbors, the shared walls would tear apart. It worked. The entire block rose like a single unit, all the buildings lifting in perfect synchronization. But the coordination required was incredible. Hundreds of men all turning their screws in perfect unison, guided by foremen with whistles and chalk marks on the walls to track the progress. The lift took weeks. The buildings never closed. Shops operated normally. Customers walked in and out. The only sign that anything unusual was happening was the constant presence of workers and the slow, almost imperceptible change in height. Another famous raising involved a hotel that was lifted while a full banquet was taking place inside. The guests were dining and drinking, completely unaware that the building they were sitting in was being raised 6 feet. The hotel management didn't tell them. They didn't want to cause alarm or lose business. The wooden cribbing used to support some of the buildings during the raising process created a serious fire hazard. Chicago was built almost entirely of wood at this time. The buildings were wood, the sidewalks were wood, even many of the streets were paved with wooden blocks because wood was cheaper and more available than stone. And now there were thousands of tons of wooden support beams and cribbing scattered throughout the city, holding up buildings while dirt was filled in underneath. When every building that was in the process of being raised sat on a forest of temporary wooden supports. Everyone knew it was a risk, but the work had to be done. They gambled that they could finish the raising and remove the wooden supports before a major fire broke out. They lost that bet in 1871. On the night of October 8, 1871, a fire started somewhere on the city's southwest side. The exact cause has never been definitively determined. The official story blamed a cow kicking over a lantern in Mrs. O'Leary's barn on DeCoven Street, though that was probably a myth created by a newspaper reporter. What's not a myth is what happened next. Chicago was a tinderbox. The summer and fall of 1871 had been hot and dry. It hadn't rained significantly in weeks. The wooden buildings were dried out. The wooden streets were parched. The city was full of lumber, construction materials, wooden cribbing from the ongoing grade-raising work, sawdust, wood shavings, all of it tinder waiting for a spark. The fire spread faster than anyone thought possible. The flames jumped across streets, lapped over the Chicago River on burning embers carried by the wind, and consumed block after block of the city. The firefighters were overwhelmed within hours. They simply didn't have the equipment or the manpower to fight a fire of this scale. The Great Chicago Fire burned for 2 days, October 8th and 9th, 1871. It destroyed 3.5 square miles of the city, essentially the entire downtown, and large portions of the north and south sides. It killed between 200 and 300 people, though the exact death toll was never determined. And it left 100,000 people homeless out of a population of about 300,000. Nearly everything that had been raised and rebuilt over the previous 15 years was gone. The Tremont House, which George Pullman had so carefully raised in 1858, was destroyed. Entire blocks of raised buildings, the fruits of years of painstaking engineering work, burned to the ground in hours. But here's the thing. The raised grade survived. The buildings burned. The wooden streets burned. Everything above ground was destroyed. But the raised grade itself, the millions of cubic yards of dirt and gravel and rubble that had been used to lift the city, that was still there. The sewers that had been installed underground were still intact. The elevated street level remained. When the city rebuilt after the fire, they built on the new, higher level. Yes, there was never any question of going back to the old grade. The raised streets had proven themselves. The sewer system worked. The drainage worked. Chicago was no longer a swampy disease trap. That problem had been solved. The fire destroyed the buildings, but it didn't destroy the engineering that had saved the city from the swamp. Chicago rebuilt fast, faster than anyone expected. Within a year, temporary structures were going up. Within 2 years, permanent buildings were being constructed. The city had learned its lesson about wood. The new Chicago was built in brick and stone. Building codes were changed to require fire-resistant construction. The wooden sidewalks were replaced with stone. The wooden street paving was replaced with brick and stone. The city that emerged from the Great Fire was fireproof in a way the old city never could have been. And it was all built on the elevated grade that George Pullman and Ellis Chesbrough and thousands of laborers had created. The sewers, now proven essential, were expanded and improved. New lines were added. The system that had been built in the 1850s and 1860s became the foundation for the modern city's infrastructure. George Pullman went on to build his railroad empire. The Pullman sleeping car made overnight train travel comfortable and turned long-distance rail travel from an ordeal into a luxury experience. Pullman became one of the richest men in America. He built an entire planned town south of Chicago for his workers, a community that bore his name and became famous in its own right. But before any of that, it's before the sleeping cars and the fortune and the model town, He was the man who proved you could lift a 4-story brick hotel full of people without waking the guests. The engineers and laborers who raised Chicago weren't just solving a drainage problem. They were proving that a city could remake itself without destroying itself. They showed that with enough planning, enough coordination, and enough sheer audacity, you could take something as permanent and fixed as a city and transform it completely while people went about their daily lives. Think about what that means. A city is supposed to be permanent. Buildings are supposed to stay where you put them. Streets are supposed to be fixed in place. The very concept of a city is based on stability and permanence. And Chicago said, no, we're going to lift all of that. We're going to raise every building, every street, every sidewalk. We're going to do it while people are living and working here. And we're going to do it because if we don't, the city will die. That's not just engineering. That's philosophy. That's a statement about what's possible when a community decides something has to be done and commits to doing it no matter how difficult it seems. Subscribe for more forgotten American history. Today, if you walk through downtown Chicago, you're walking on streets that are 6 to 10 feet higher than they were in 1850. The original street level is still down there, buried under more than a century and a half of city growth and development. The original sidewalks, the original building foundations, they're all still there, preserved in the filled dirt that raised the city. Some of the old Chicago is still accessible. There are underground pedestrian tunnels that run beneath the streets, originally built for freight movement but now used for utilities and building access. If you go down into these tunnels, you can see the original street level, you can see the foundations of buildings that were raised. Some older buildings still have their original lower levels intact, now functioning as basements or sub-basements. If you know where to look, you can find old doorways that used to be at street level, now several feet underground. Stand at the bottom of one of these spaces and look up, and you're looking at 6 to 10 feet of history, the literal foundation of modern Chicago. There are walking tours that take you through these underground spaces, showing you the remnants of the old city. Tour guides point out old storefronts, old brick-paved streets, old sidewalks, all of it buried beneath the modern city. It's like an archaeological site, except instead of being thousands of years old, it's only 170 years old. The raising of Chicago is one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century, and almost nobody knows it happened. Ask most people what they know about Chicago's history, and they'll mention the Great Fire of 1871. They might mention Al Capone and Prohibition. They might mention the skyscrapers and the architecture. But they won't know that the entire city was lifted out of a swamp by men with jackscrews, turning 1/4 turn at a time, raising buildings while people slept inside them. We remember the Great Fire because it was dramatic and destructive. So we remember the skyscrapers because they're visible and impressive. But we forget the decade when an entire city existed at 2 different elevations simultaneously, when you had to climb stairs to cross the street, when engineers were performing the impossible on a daily basis. The original Chicago is still down there, beneath your feet if you're standing in the downtown area, 6 to 10 feet below the modern street level. Every skyscraper foundation goes down through it. Every basement extends into it. Every time someone digs a foundation for a new building, they excavate through the layers of filled dirt that raised the city. They didn't tear down the old Chicago. They didn't abandon it. They picked it up, they lifted the whole thing into the air and built a new foundation underneath it. And then, when fire destroyed what they'd raised, they built it again, in brick and stone this time, on the same elevated foundation that had saved the city from the swamp. That's what cities do. They survive. They adapt. They rebuild. Chicago was born in a swamp, raised itself out of the mud through an engineering project that seemed impossible, burned to the ground in the most destructive fire in American history up to that time, and rose again on the same foundation that saved it the first time. The story of the raising is the story of American engineering at its most ambitious and optimistic. It's the story of a city that refused to die, even when disease and disaster should have killed it. It's the story of thousands of workers whose names we don't know, turning jackscrews in perfect coordination, lifting buildings inch by inch while the world went on around them. It's the story of men like George Pullman and Ellis Chesbrough who looked at an impossible problem and decided it wasn't impossible after all. It just required doing something no one had ever done before, on a scale no one had ever attempted. That's the city Chicago built. Not the one on the postcards with the gleaming skyscrapers and the beautiful lakefront, the one underneath, the one 6 feet down, the one that made everything else possible. The next time you're in Chicago, walking down Michigan Avenue or State Street, remember that you're walking on top of another city. The streets you're on were once 6 feet in the air, held up by jack screws while men filled in dirt underneath. The buildings around you sit on foundations that were lifted while people worked inside. And remember the 1,424 people who died in the cholera epidemic of 1854, whose deaths convinced a city that the impossible had to be attempted. They died so that future generations wouldn't have to live in a swamp. That's the debt we owe to forgotten workers and forgotten victims. They made the modern city possible. They paid the price, and we inherited the benefit. The original Chicago is still down there, buried but not gone, forgotten but not lost, 6 feet below the surface, waiting for anyone who cares to look.